The Prime Minister brought the Chancellor and the Defence Secretary with him to Poland to unveil a defence spending commitment he says matches the heightened dangers of our age.
We've had the pleasure of being here 3 weeks now.
Visiting British troops who are stationed on Poland's eastern border, Rishi Sunak pledged that defence spending, if he remained Prime Minister, would reach 2.5% of GDP by the end of the decade.
Today is a landmark moment in the defence of the United Kingdom. This is a generational investment in British security and British prosperity. It makes us safer at home and stronger abroad.
Rishi Sunak's move from a commitment to spend 2.5% of GDP on defence when resources allow to a hard and fast date. He says he can do that without extra borrowing. But it comes only weeks after a budget in which many experts judged he'd actually slightly cut defence spending. Rishi Sunak, though, says it's all fully funded. Rishi Sunak met with the NATO Secretary-General and Poland's new Prime Minister, Donald Tusk, all of them talking of the mounting security dangers of these times. Autocratic states conniving to reshape the world and defeat democracies.
I want to talk to you about how we equip you to do your duty in an increasingly dangerous world. We've entered a period in history in which competition between countries has sharpened profoundly. An axis of authoritarian states with different values to ours, like Russia, Iran, North Korea and China, are increasingly assertive. And they're increasingly acting together, making common cause in an attempt to reshape the world order. Now, I know there are some people who will think these are faraway problems, but they are not.
The problems of recruitment in defence are vast, also of procurement budget management, not least in the case of the nuclear deterrent. But Rishi Sunak's hoping he's put in enough money to deal with that and to deal with some of his troubles back home. Donald Tusk, the Polish Prime Minister, has a phrase for the current state of Europe. He calls it pre-war, and Rishi Sunak's own party is in a similar state. Tories who've watched defence spending slip from 2.6% of GDP in recent years down to 2.2%, well, most of them cheer the rise to 2.5%, promised by Rishi Sunak today. But that uptick looks tiny when you look back to the spending in the Cold War era, the most dangerous era, Rishi Sunak said, until today.
We discussed the security of Poland, the security of the United Kingdom, security of Europe, and in the obvious context too, because there is war going on right beyond our border. It is not coincidental. The United Kingdom and Poland, who stand as a very good example of cooperation and coordination, we of course spoke about reinforcing our cooperation.
Tonight, Rishi Sunak is in the air en route to Berlin. Germany had been nagging Britain to increase its spending on defence, and he'll hope to have mollified their leaders, as well as maybe some of his critics back home.
Gary Gibbon. Well, it is highly unusual for a Prime Minister to make such a major spending pledge outside a budget. So let's take a closer look at the numbers with our economics correspondent, Helia Ibrahimi. Helia.
Well, Matt, let's take a detailed look of how we get to that 2.5% and what it means in cash terms, because we know that for the MAD settlement this year was meant to be £55.5 billion. For the NATO terms, the government ends up kitchen sinking a bunch of stuff like wartime pensions, Ukraine, intelligence. That all gets chalked up in 24-25 as £64 billion. But you can see over the next 6 years, it climbs to 2.5%. That last column in 2030 is £87.1 billion. Now, the government say this adds up to an extra £75 billion. But Matt, that's a rather interesting calculation because it assumes that defence spending does not increase ever from today's settlement, and that's really unrealistic. One economist, in fact, described it as ridiculous to me.
It's not exactly spare change. Can we afford it?
Well, ironically, today we got our latest figures for the debt and deficit, and our debts stand at £2.7 trillion. That is more than 98% of GDP. That's the highest level since the 1960s outside the pandemic. £92,000 per household, can you believe, Matt? And that's not all. The deficit, too, was higher than expected at £120 billion. Better than last year, but sadly, worse than official expectations and worse by £6.6 billion. Now, that's going to heap huge pressure, Matt, on the government and the Chancellor's headroom. Even before you get to the defence spending, now they've promised that this spending is not going to add any additional borrowing. It's not going to come from tax rises, is it? So that creates lots of worries from people about unprotected departments like local government, like police and prisons.
Which beckons the question, is there any detail on what the government's announced?
Well, there is one claim that you could raise £2.9 billion from cuts to the civil service. That's axing an incredible 70,000 jobs. Another claim is that you could siphon off £1.6 billion from research and development. But let me leave you with this one thought, Matt. If we reflect on the graphic that we saw in Gary's piece showing that really steep decline in defence spending, well, that money has been gobbled up by NHS spending, and that is unlikely to change over the next few years. And I don't know how we operate in a world where both NHS spending and defence spending is going up.
There's a lot of swivel action in these stories. I feel like a tennis umpire. Heli Ibrahimi, thanks very much indeed. Kieran in Leeds, over to you.
Cheers, Matt. Well, a little earlier I spoke to James Heappey, who was the Armed Forces Minister until last month, and I asked him if Rishi Sunak's announcement today falls short of what he wanted.
Well, look, I've made the case for 2.5 and then a further increase to 3%. But I think that the scale of what the Prime Minister has announced today needs to be taken and, frankly, for people like me, celebrated, because this is a £75 billion additional commitment to defence that will transform the MOD's finances, give industry the strongest signal to scale up and a long-term commitment to UK defence spending. And most importantly of all, it will make our armed forces, such as they are at the moment, more lethal and more sustainable.
It is a big commitment, £75 billion. It's not money you can just find down the back of the sofa. And the Prime Minister said it's fully funded. But we don't know the detail of how it's going to be funded, do we? Do you know?
Well, look, I mean, I don't know the full detail. I was fortunate enough to speak briefly to the Prime Minister and the Defence Secretary this morning, and my understanding is that this is the money that is hard-won through a number of years of Whitehall efficiency drives and is expected to be further realised by efficiency drives to come. Now, that makes this
£75 billion in efficiency drives. That's just cloud cuckoo stuff, isn't it? I mean, we're already expecting, as we've heard, pretty severe public spending cuts after the next election. Does this announcement today, this £75 billion, mean more public spending cuts?
Well, if you say so, Kieran. I mean, I think you seem to have more knowledge of the public finances than I do.
Unprotected departments.
No. Well, I was offering you a solution. You've just dismissed it out of hand. What I know is that the Prime Minister has taken the right choice, given the changing geostrategic environment, to invest in our nation's defence and security.
What do you think we're going to get in return for this investment? Because there's a £17 billion black hole, isn't there, in the defence budget? So will a lot of it just go into plugging that hole? What are we going to get in return?
I hope that what you end up with as a consequence of this commitment today is investment in some of the most achingly boring capabilities that exist within defence. The investment in the accommodation and the infrastructure that we house our troops in and that supports our regiments, our ships and our RAF squadrons around the country. That's the stuff that really puts back into the force the resilience, the war-fighting resilience that underpins our conventional deterrence.
will it pay for a bigger armed forces? Because that's shrunk, isn't it? And
no one's claimed, the Prime Minister hasn't claimed, the Defence Secretary hasn't claimed, I've never claimed, in fact, quite the reverse. I've been explicit in always saying that 2.5% is what is needed to make the force that we've got now more lethal, more resilient, more deployable, and therefore to deliver our conventional deterrence with the force that we've currently got. If you want to have a discussion over the course of the next 5 to 10 years about the way that geostrategic trends are moving and whether or not the UK armed forces need to be bigger, let's have that discussion, but not at the expense of celebrating what is a really important and necessary decision by the Prime Minister today.
James Heappey, thank you ever so much for speaking with us.
Thanks for having me on. Thank you.